University. Her investigation has specialized in corpus research from a functional and cognitive perspective. She has a particular interest in verbal argument structures, and focuses on the functional relations between formal syntactic structures in Romance languages, and especially in Spanish. The title of her talk today is Towards an Integrated Account of Pragmatic Markers, Exploring Levels of Social Indexicality and Sentiment Expression in Contemporary Spanish. Sorry for my English. So, Renata, thank you very much for being here. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you, first of all, Vanessa and Marcia, for inviting me to participate in this conference of your, well, apparently very productive research group. So my talk is also in English, but of course, you can ask me questions in French, in Portuguese, and I will try to answer in whatever language comes up first. So indeed, the title of my talk is Towards an Integrated Account of Pragmatic Markers, and it's a talk in which I would like to explore two possibilities, two methods, namely, or theories, the one of social indexicality and another one of automatic sentiment expression. And I would like to check whether these theories and methods can help us to overcome a number of issues related to the analysis of pragmatic markers. So this will be the structure of my talk. So of course, first of all, I will provide some background information. More particularly, I will try to motivate why I think it's interesting to have another talk on pragmatic markers, something that is motivated by a number of problems I found over the last years when analyzing pragmatic markers. Then I will give very quickly some background information about the nature of the data we will be working with, which is a corpus of spontaneous colloquial Spanish that was homemade in Ghent and in Madrid. Of course, we will then move on to the most important part of the analysis and the results. And I hope that at the end of the presentation, well, we will have a kind of take-home message as to a number of future insights or interesting insights for future perspectives for the analysis of pragmatic markers. Now, those of you in the room who have studied pragmatic markers or discourse markers or whatever it is called know that it is a linguistic phenomenon that really lacks a coherent definition and also clear terminology. There are many different classifications. So just to make it clear, today, when I refer to pragmatic marker, I refer to multifunctional elements with a procedural core, meaning whose specific interpretation is negotiated by the context, which is a definition by Fraser. And of course, classical examples, we heard some cases this morning for Spanish in Argentina, but in English, you would have the you know, the I mean, the well, the etc. So as the following graph taken from the Scopus database shows, there has been an increasing interest for the category of pragmatic markers, especially since the beginning of the 21st century. So why then, indeed, another talk on pragmatic markers? Well, I will try to explain this in a minute. Because, well, I have myself also contributed to that increasing number of studies on pragmatic markers, mostly on Spanish. And so they were mostly empirical descriptive analyses of 4 pragmatic markers. So in Spanish, that would be the nada, which is well, sabes, the you know, the en plan, the like, and also the es que, it is that. So I did that in collaboration with my colleagues. And just to give you an idea of the kind of pragmatic markers we will be talking about today, I just quickly give an example for each case. So in one, pues, ¿qué pasó en biología? Pues nada, en biología, que me ha regañado la profe. Well, in biology, etc. Or in 2, we have a case of sabes, that would be the you know, of course. In 3, we have a specific case for youth language in Spanish, which is the en plan. Y los emoticonos los dice Siri en plan corazón rojo con. So, and Siri says the emoticons like red heart with. And then the last case is the es que. ¿Qué dices? Bueno, es que yo no tengo Netflix. Well, I don't have Netflix. And well, in most descriptive studies or empirical investigations on pragmatic markers, I was concerned with questions such as, well, of course, what do they add to the speech act? And also, when you continue the analysis of different pragmatic markers, are they near synonymous? Are they interchangeable, or are they more like in a complementary distribution? Now, so over the years, I had a number of problems, questions, which I discussed with different colleagues, with students, and it appeared that, well, no one could give me a clear answer to those questions. So the result, so the talk today is the result of, well, some more reflections about those methodological issues, and hopefully, which will give us some insights in the category of pragmatic markers and will lead to overcome these obstacles. So for today, I have like 3 main research questions. So the first one is, well, a very basic one, but it's not a simple one. If you describe the meaning of the pragmatic markers, like the 4 ones that we saw, what components or what aspects should we take into account? Linguistic aspects, so the intralinguistic ones, but also the contextual ones. The second question is then, okay, if we want to assess the meaning of these pragmatic markers or their functions, how can we do that in an objective or principled way? So in order to avoid too much intuitive classifications of tokens in our corpus. And then the third one is then, how can we then model the analysis of pragmatic markers? And is it possible to do that through some constructional modeling? So indeed, to lift already a tip of the veil. So the first question about what kind of aspects are involved in the overall meaning of pragmatic markers, I will see whether the integration of the theory on social indexicality can offer some additional interesting insights. As to the second question about what objective criteria can we use to define the meaning and function, I want to share with you the outcomes of an automatic sentiment analysis of the context in which they appear. And then as concerns the last question, is there some transparent modeling possible of pragmatic markers? I will then also offer, well, a possible constructional model of pragmatic markers. Okay, so what about the data we will be working with? So our work on pragmatic markers is based on the CORMA corpus, so the Corpus Oral del Español Hablado en Madrid. As I said, it's a homemade corpus that we recorded between 2016 and 2019 in Madrid. So they are informal conversations, and it is the result of a collaboration between our research team in Ghent and so local researchers in Madrid, so mostly from the UNED. Now, the CORMA corpus is what you could call a direct corpus, so it contains about 100 spontaneous conversations, so between speakers in different communicative contexts. So following the classification of Bries, it would be, or the corpus could be defined as a corpus with prototypical informal conversations, meaning that there is equality among the participants. They talk about, well, interpersonal topics, about the weather, about clothing, etc. And so the result was then a corpus of about 58 recorded hours, which would be transcribed as transcribed the equivalent of 500,000 words. So we took into account the communicative setting. So this is important for what we will do later on. So we have 4 communicative settings. So most conversations were recorded between friends, but we also have quite some conversations in customer services. So for instance, a hairdresser, a clothing shop, and also conversations between family members and acquaintances. It's a sociolinguistically balanced corpus, which means that we took into account as much as possible the profile of the speakers, following age, gender, and socio-cultural class. So as to age, we have a lot of data for teenagers, so which we will call the second generation, but we also have data for the third generation, so the adults, the fourth generation, and some data for children. As is often the case, we found more women than men that were willing to participate, but well, of course, we take that into account when we look at the results. And so finally, as to the last parameter, the socio-cultural class, this is the hardest one to define. In fact, we just took into account where the conversation was recorded. And so the northern areas of Madrid are normally classified as representative of medium high, and so the southern areas of the lower socio-cultural classes. But as you can see here, there is many data for which we don't have information about their background. Okay, so over the years, what we did was we extracted all the pragmatic marker uses for the 4 markers I mentioned before, which gives these numbers. And so you see here that SK is the most frequent one, so it appears everywhere, followed by en plan and sabes, and then we also have some cases for nada. Okay, so these are the data we will be working with in order to address and answer the 3 research questions. So, and let's start with the first one, namely, when we talk about the meaning of pragmatic markers, so what do they mean in the conversation? Which aspects should we take into account? Okay, so it seems like a very simple question. Where does it come from? Well, in fact, let's go back to the start. We can define a pragmatic marker as a form meaning component or pair. Which means that what most of us do, if we adopt a semasiological approach, what we do is then we take a marker, such as the ones that we heard this morning, the viste, for instance. You could take that marker and then study in a corpus all the functions that it has and try to establish the list of micro functions. Okay. Then you have the principle of context dependence, which says that, well, in fact, meaning, also the meaning of a pragmatic marker, is like emergent. And so it really depends on the intention of the speaker. We said this morning, it depends on the personality of the speaker, etc., etc., which then leads to the other opposite, namely that it would not be possible to define the list of microfunctions of a pragmatic marker because, as Martín Sorrentino and Portoles also say, it is just not possible to do that because there are as many connotations as there are contexts of use. Okay, so that's already a problem. Now, what we did then, since it's hard to say where does nada stop, where does, for instance, en plan begin, let's then do it another way and try another approach and work with the macro functions. So no, not the micro, but the macro functions. And so in the literature, but also in the corpus, you would then see that all 4 of them, and here there is no difference, they can operate at 2 main levels of discourse. So they can express interpersonal modal functions on the one hand, and they can have metadiscursive functions or both at the same time, which makes it harder, following the principle of syntagmatic polyfunctionality. So indeed, we see that on the interpersonal pole, all 4 of them can be used with expressive functions. They can be appellative, so they are used to call upon the attention of the interlocutor. And also what could be classified here as modal are the functions of the markers when they are involved in politeness strategies, so face work to protect the own face, so they are like mitigating strategies, etc., etc. Then, as metadiscursive function, what counts here is, okay, when it typically appears at the start of the turn. So it just indicates I'm going to take the turn. Or the other way around, you can find it at the closing of a turn as filler words. The viste this morning was frequently used as a filler word. So you want to continue and you don't find the right word. Or it can even indicate that some argumentation is going to be started. So an explanation, an approximation. Okay, so these are some examples. I'm not going to read them in detail, but if you want to check them out, we can do that afterwards. What they show is that sabes, en plan, y nada, in this case, the examples under 1, in fact, they all have metadiscursive function. In 2, all of them have like the modal function. So the speaker in these cases is going to introduce a personal opinion, but first uses a pragmatic marker as to, well, a kind of safe protector because it's like more approximation, okay? Good, so apparently all 4 of them have very similar behavior. So why do they then exist in the language? That's why I tried to look at the macro functions from a more quantitative perspective to see whether one marker would have predominantly more metadiscursive functions as the other. So here you have the data. We're not going to look at the numbers in detail, but what you see here is, well, some test of significance, which would show that there is no significant correlation between one of the 2 functions and so one of the 4 markers. So this means that it's not that they can be distinguished based on the frequency of one of the 2 macro functions. And then as a last argument here, so this is a fragment that comes from our Corma corpus, and you see here a use of es que. Es que, pues la verdad que lo fui como, it's just that, well, now, in fact, what you could do here very easily, you could replace the es que by sabes, by nada, by en plan, by bueno, by mira. So again, this raises the question about the near synonymy or the synonymy. So it shows that as to their linguistic, intralinguistic classification, they are very similar. And if you want to know what they really mean, it could be important to go to a more multidimensional approach, adding other aspects of meaning. So we have to elaborate on the pole of meaning of pragmatic markers. And of course, this squares in general with cognitive and functional linguistics. So especially in cognitive linguistics, that says that meaning is really embodied. So it's about how you perceive the world. So you could add some element there. In functional linguistics, the idea is that language fulfills different systemic functions, namely the ideational. So you add something based on your experiences. There are interpersonal functions and also textual functions. Okay, so where does this lead us as to the analysis of pragmatic markers? Well, it leads towards the conclusion that a more synergetic and integrated perspective concerning the meaning of pragmatic markers that not only takes as a basis the referential conceptual meaning, the contextual meanings, but also possibly some social meanings, connotations, and also some affective meanings. So these could add to the overall profile of the pragmatic markers. So this is what I would like to show in this talk. So which are the social meanings of the 4 pragmatic markers? Do they have that social meaning or not? And do some of them have a particular affective meaning, which could then explain why in a discourse, one marker is chosen over the other. Okay, so let us start with the theory of social indexicality. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with that theory, but a starting point could be this idea by Mills, namely that one's identity and role is constituted in language. So the idea is that as a speaker, you really perform your identity in negotiation with other people, drawing on the language resources of the society as a whole. So this is the starting point for a theory of social indexicality, which really says that linguistic signs also carry social meaning that depend on the linguistic community. And so, of course, the contextualization and community meanings are important. So what we do as speakers when we use language is that we can decide, not necessarily, but we can decide to stage a number of aspects of our personality, including our age, gender, ethnicity, etc. So that could contribute to the stylization of a particular linguistic element. And also interesting is that what you then get is the phenomenon of alignment or accommodation, namely that specific linguistic elements can be chosen as to show that you are members of a particular in-group or even to exclude members that do not belong to your community. So Ghent, in her last paper, or one of the last papers, she takes this idea a bit further. And so she compares the language to, for instance, hairstyle or clothing style. So in that sense that you could just by some linguistic elements recognize the community someone belongs to. Okay, now what about pragmatic markers and this theory of social indexicality? Well, according to the literature, for instance, Beeching, they should be really readily available to implement that social indexicality because they are mainly used in familiar contexts of kindness, which are said to be typical to stage social indexicality. Now, what has been done before, of course, there are many studies on sociolinguistic variations in the use of pragmatic markers, but I think it's interesting to take a look at this from another perspective in order to compare the different pragmatic markers with the idea that speakers can actively choose them and also compare the pragmatic markers, well, between them as if there were different options in the mind of a speaker. So this leads to the following question. What social meaning do contemporary Spanish speakers perform, so actively, when they are using one of the four pragmatic markers in this case? And do they all perform social meaning? It's not necessarily the case. Okay, so if you would study pragmatic markers, you could study a whole bunch of characteristics. So I will limit myself today to two aspects, very simple ones, in fact. So namely, first of all, the productivity of a pragmatic marker, but here productivity also in its most basic sense, namely how frequently is it used by different groups. So the normalized token frequency. And then I also wanted to check whether when they are used, if they are used in the same way. So do they fulfill the same communicative needs in different social groups? And of course, the classical, the usual suspects are there concerning the patterns of variation, the age, the gender, and the socio-cultural class. Okay, so I will present tables with numbers. Again, we will not discuss the numbers. I will just talk about the conclusions, but of course we can always come back to them. So the first table gives the normalized frequencies of the four pragmatic markers following, in this case, according to the four generations. Now, there is a very simple statistical test that says that, well, there seems to be a slight correlation between the form and the age of the speaker. So there is something going on. Now, what you could do then, and I think that's interesting, is that you then check which cells in the table contribute to that significance. So you look at the standardized residuals. And so I drew a heat map of those standardized residuals. And here you see the four pragmatic markers, and then to what extent they are under or overused in the four age groups. So some interesting tendencies. You see that the sabes, the you know, is slightly overused by speakers of the second generation, so the teenagers. Nada is quite equally distributed, but well, it tends to be also slightly overused, although 2 would be the cutoff point, by speakers of the third generation, so the adults. The SK is quite evenly distributed, and then you have the en plan, and of course the model shows that en plan is by large preferred by teenagers, okay? So there seems to be something going on as to the expression of your age, and it might determine which pragmatic marker you would choose. Now, I did the same for the four pragmatic markers and the gender of the speaker, but here there is no significance. So women and men do not have a preference. So it's not that they want to mark their gender by the use of a pragmatic marker. So in fact, we shouldn't even look into the standardized residuals, but I did, just because I wanted to show that, well, sabes is slightly overused by male speakers, and I thought that was interesting, also because it corresponds to the intuition that I had when reading the corpus. And finally, I did the same with the class, so socio-cultural class, that is already hard to define, I admit, but again, no significance, so no standardized residuals, but I just wanted to show that sabes is also slightly overused by speakers of the lower classes, and nada, well, in that case, seems to be preferred by speakers of the medium-high class. Now, remember, I also wanted to check whether when they are used, to what extent they would fulfill different communicative needs. So if the interpersonal function is overrepresented in some social class, well, the data for NPLAN are still under construction, but everything seemed to be non-significant, which means that also for age, if you choose a pragmatic marker, well, you use the same functions independently of your age, and the same goes for gender. So it's not that women would have more interpersonal functions than men. No, everything is non-significant, and the same goes for class. Okay, so this leads to the following intermediate conclusion about pragmatic markers and their possible social meaning. So as to function, everything was non-significant. And it appeared that the choice for one marker over the other is, well, to some extent, besides all the other linguistic parameters, of course, it is also determined by the age of the speaker, especially in the case of NPLAN, but also for sabes, also nada, and SK, that seemed to be the all-over passepartout pragmatic marker. For gender and class, we didn't find very significant correlations, except that sabes was a bit more connected to male speech, and also to lower classes, and nada to higher speech. Okay, so where does this all bring us as to the description of the meaning of pragmatic markers? Well, I think that based on these sociolinguistic data, you could add something to the description of the meaning by translating this to different levels of indexicality. So this is the model by Silverstein. So he says that in the language, you have elements of first order. Now, what is that? That would be like, okay, everyone recognizes it as a typical feature, for instance, of oral speech, informal speech, okay? So it's really widespread, and in the language, it does not change very quickly. So we could argue that SK is like, in its description, you could add that it's a first order indexical. Then the second order indexes would be then those elements that are recognized by members of the in-group. Okay, so if you hear that marker frequently, then you know, oh, probably it's also a younger speaker or whatever. So I would argue that sabes and nada are markers of second order indexicality. And then you have the third order indexicals, which really count as emblems of a particular group, of a particular community. And you can recognize them by the humorous observations that are made on their account. There are meta comments on their use. And they're also, as to language change, characterized by rapid changes. So because they are that emblematic, people can also leave them behind very quickly. And I would argue that NPLAN is a third order index. For instance, it just takes you 5 seconds to scroll the social media and ask and check for some comments on the NPLAN. And you see that the youngsters themselves, they make jokes about their own use of NPLAN. And then you also see that it is stylized from an external observation. This is a picture from a couple of years ago where teachers in a high school explicitly prohibited the use of NPLAN. So this indicates that it's really a third order index. I did the same exercise for nada, for sabes, and for SK, but I couldn't find anything comparable, except for the Hilo Sabes with Julio Iglesias, that went viral like over 10 years ago. But I wasn't able to do any recent discoveries. So yeah, you could then situate them at the 3 levels. Okay, so that's the first part, but still, I think it's not enough if you want to add to description of the meaning of pragmatic markers. So this brought me to the second question, namely, if you want to describe the pragmatic function, how can you do that in an objective way? You have subjective and objective, mostly because I'm not a native speaker of Spanish, and you can imagine how often people look at you and say, but how do you know that this is an expressive function, you know? So yeah, I was quite concerned about that, and I've been looking for answers over the past years. So, of course, this has to do with an overall difficulty in linguistics. If you want to do semantics and pragmatics, how can you capture something as abstract as meaning? It's non-perceivable. So before I worked on word order, and that was much easier. It's before or after, and then you can have your hypothesis. But pragmatics and meaning, how do you do that? So, of course, this is a result of the empirical turn, of the quantitative turn. But luckily, Dylan Glynn, at some point, he said, well, maybe it's not necessary to find an objective way to describe meaning, but let's try and do it in a principled way. So to have like a well-defined model. So I thought, okay, let's try and do that. This had led before already to different accounts, so systematic accounts for analyzing semantics, especially near synonymy. And of course, this is based mostly on the distributional hypothesis. So look at the collocations of an item, and they will tell you something more about the meaning of that item. Yeah? So this is the famous saying by Furt, you shall know a word by the company it keeps. Now, I try to do the same for pragmatic markers. If I want to know more about the meaning of pragmatic markers, I should look at the collocations of pragmatic markers. So can we also say, you shall know a pragmatic marker by the company it keeps? So that's what I tried over the years. And for instance, with my colleague Elena Sofra, when we distinguished different functions for sabes, we tried to, well, look for formal indications in the context. Is there a response by the interlocutor? Is there an imperative use? Or for instance, can we see that there are superlatives? Is there intensification? Or are they like repetitions, which could then be indications of metadiscursive functions, etc., etc. Okay, so this seems nice, but there was one big problem. In many examples, none of these formal marks were present. Okay, so how can you then objectively or in a principled way assess the function of the pragmatic markers in those tokens? Now, this morning, we also talked about the position of pragmatic markers or discourse markers. And well, there has been quite some work about, okay, probably at that and that position, it's most probable that you will have a metadiscursive function on the left or right periphery. But well, it didn't really help us either, because what we saw was that, okay, you could say that, for instance, the metadiscursive function often is found in initial position, but of course, there is no one-to-one relationship. So still, there was no principled way or independent way of assessing the pragmatic function. So, well, I continued looking for answers or solutions. And that's when I came across at some point with the automatic sentiment analysis. I don't know if you know what that means, the automatic sentiment analysis. Well, there are different models, but the ones that I used is the Lingmotiv application, or the Lingmotiv model that was designed by colleagues from the University of Malaga. So there is a whole description here, but what is it in a nutshell? So it's a lexicon-based, linguistically motivated, user-friendly, GUI-enabled, which means that you can easily interact with the application. Well, so it's a sentiment analysis desktop application. So it means that you can upload a text or a corpus, in our case, the Korma corpus, and it would give you a number of scores, because what it does is that it automatically, so it's the computer who does the work, automatically identifies sentiment-laden words and or text fragments, positive, negative, or neutral. It's lexicon-based, so it's based on what do the words mean, so also outside of the context. And it gives you information on the text polarity and also the sentiment intensity, as I will show in a minute. And then it gives you just two scores, the text sentiment score and the text sentiment intensity score, and then an overall score for the text. So what did it give us for the Korma corpus? So we uploaded, or we discussed with the colleagues, and they gave us so the whole analysis for the Korma corpus. It says that as to the text sentiment scores, it's slightly negative, but in fact it means that it's quite average. So it's a normal text. It's not a marketing text that would give different scores. So it's quite regular. And as to the intensity, it's mostly factual, which means that people talk about daily life. Okay, so that was quite good. And so the output looks as follows. So here you have the IDs for all the different conversations in the Corma corpus. And then we were interested here in the text sentiment scores. Is it slightly positive or is it slightly negative? Or more extreme cases, which are not mentioned here, but extremely negative or positive. You can also have that kind of conversations. And as to the intensity, is it factual, very intense, or slightly intense, etc. So it gives you all that information. But what is more interesting is that besides the scores, you get like a whole analysis of your transcriptions. So this is, for instance, a part of a conversation in a clothes shop. And so what is indicated in green would be marked as a positive text fragment. What is indicated in red would be marked as a negative one. You can con niños es muy difícil. So it's hard with children. Okay, so it makes sense. So this is interesting because then you can start looking also at the context in which the pragmatic markers appear. Now, first, for me, that model was unknown. I had to check whether it would give some interesting results. So I did a first check as to, okay, if I just look into the conversations with speakers of only the adolescents or only the adults, do I get different scores? And it's quite interesting because it showed that conversations among adults are fairly positive. So when you're an adult, you tend to talk about, I don't know, in general, it's fairly positive, whereas the adolescents are fairly negative. But this could, of course, be explained by the fact that they use more taboo words, which can be more negatively connotated. And as to intensity, it's mostly factual. But what was remarkable is here, this figure, so that in the third generation, the conversations are slightly more intense. But then this was due to some conversations between a hairdresser, a very expressive hairdresser, and her clients. So you see that this can have an impact. I also checked for gender. And so I looked into the text sentiment score and compared conversations only between women with those between men. And well, we women, we tend to be to have conversations that are slightly more positively loaded. But what the data did not confirm was that conversations between women would be more intense than conversations between men. So at least not in our corpus. And then the last thing I wanted to show is that we also compare the discourse settings, so friends, family, and the customer services. And there you clearly see that in customer services, so in the hairdresser, in the pharmacies, they tend to be more positively connotated because, of course, they want to sell you something, and they are also the most intense conversations. So then I thought, well, when I see all that, I think the method works to some extent, and we can use it maybe to analyze the functions of the pragmatic markers. Because just to remind, what I was trying to do was I tried to find a more principled way to define the meaning of pragmatic markers, and so see which are the collocations of pragmatic markers following the distributional hypothesis. So is it then possible to use the surrounding text fragments with their positive or negative sentiment as indications, as collocations and indications of the inherent meaning of the pragmatic marker? So just to give you some ideas, so this is a case of sabes that would appear in a high intensity fragment and also negative, okay? This is a case of en plan that appears also in a high intensive text fragment, but and that could count as a positive collocation. People are talking about innovations, etc. And this, if it's just white, it means that it's neutral. So this is a case of sabes and nada in a neutral context. But we have to be careful with those models because it's not always working. So here, for instance, the case of SK, that the model marks as positive sentiment. Es que hay distintas marcas de meso. Mira, a lo mejor es algo de eso. I think the positive indication has to do with the mejor, but it's a discourse marker. A lo mejor, maybe. So you have to be careful. And here is a context, es para la tensión. It's for the blood pressure. But tensión here has nothing negative in it, but still it is marked as negative. So, well, you have to do a manual cleaning of what you see in your corpus. Okay, so I want to assess the functions of pragmatic markers through the analysis of the sentiment associated with their collocations, and this breaks down into two sub-questions. So first of all, I wanted to see whether the 4 pragmatic markers we are studying correlates with preferably positive, negative, or neutral text fragments. And then, secondly, I also wanted then to find out, because that was the main goal, if I could use those sentiments to assess interpersonal functions versus metadiscursive functions. And I would expect that the metadiscursive functions would be more neutral and the modal ones would be positively or negatively marked. Now, as to the first question, so again, here we have the data, well, slightly significant, but well, let's look at what we find for the standardized residuals. So it's not very significant. So it's not that sabes or in plan or SK are always appear in a positive or a negative text fragment, but there are some tendencies. For instance, as to nada, nada literally meaning nothing, but it seems to appear more frequently in context with a positive sentiment, which makes sense because it's really about protection of the image, etc. And the SK, that is also correlated positively with neutral context. So remember from the social indexicality, this is the all-round pragmatic markers. Sabes and en plan were marked as social indices, but here as to sentiment, nothing interesting pops out. So they do not necessarily add meaning on all levels. So yeah, can we find something? For some markers, we can find a correlation. And then of course, the last question, can the automatic sentiment analysis help us to define the macro function in a more principled way? So this is then what we classified as intersubjective functions, and that appear, here you have the sabes, as well, marked with high intensity and with different sentiments. So here it works. Here as well, fueron super majos, en plan me dijeron mazo cosas, sabes? So this is also interpersonal modal and very expressive. On other occasions, we have different instances in the corpus of metadiscursive uses of the pragmatic markers that appear in those white text fragments, so that are neutral, so that works as well. So we have the SK, the en plan, etc. But of course, a one-to-one relationship is again an illusion. It gives you an additional indication about the function, but like nothing, like everything, I would say, you cannot really count on it in a blind way, but you can use it as an extra instrument, because here, for instance, this is what the model would mark as neutral. Yo es que creía que venías de intercambio. It's neutral, but in fact, we would classify it as modal because it's like the own opinion, introducing an opinion of the speaker. And here we have, vale, pues nada, pues un besito, venga, buen viaje. You have in Spanish the pues nada, that typically appears at the end of a conversation. It's just like to say goodbye. Pues nada, here it's marked positively because of buen viaje and besito, probably, but well, it not necessarily has to be marked as positive. Okay, so the last part, the shortest one, what can we do with all this information if you want to have a more transparent or the most possible, most transparent model possible for pragmatic markers? So can we do, as we saw this morning in the talk by Martin, can we do constructional modeling? This question makes sense, I think. So I like construction grammar a lot, mostly because of the idea of the all-inclusive principle and the idea that, well, all levels of language use are interesting, also discourse level phenomena. Of course, I'm not the first one to come up with this idea. There have been constructional approaches to particles, to pragmatic markers, to parentheticals, comment clauses, etc. And with a colleague, I edited a volume for constructions and frames in which, for instance, internet memes were also considered as constructions. So there is quite some work to be done there. But what I think is interesting also for everything that we saw until now is the idea that, well, speakers do have, they observe regular patterns in discourse as well. So it's not just about argument structures. They have conventionalized functions, so speech management functions, for instance. And so that's one thing. And another thing is that as speakers, well, we have networks of expressions, of schemas, and we choose between, for instance, individual forms. So that's why I think that the constructional model is very interesting if you want to work from a semasiological approach. So look at the form, study the meanings, but also if you want to do it the other way around. So you have functions and you want to see what exists in the language to express those functions. So yeah, it's really a model that offers an integrated approach. So this is just one suggestion. It's not certainly not a final one, but what you could have for pragmatic markers, if you would then describe at the form, you could talk about, of course, morphology, is it second person, etc. Prosody as well. I haven't talked about prosody. It could also be a more principled way of accessing the function. But I think it's interesting to look at what are all the aspects of meaning of a pragmatic marker. So you have the more conceptual meaning, the macro function, which is the traditional classification. But yeah, you could also talk about its function at politeness, at the level of politeness. So the face work, it has to be separated, I think, from the macro functions. And then you could add information about the typical discourse setting. Where does it appear? The emotionality, is it? Not necessarily, but it could be typical for positive, negative, or neutral settings. The intensity as well, high intense, low, neutral. And also the social indexicality. Is it a first order index, second or third order? Okay, so as a final idea, so you could then do different types of constructional modeling. There are many different options, but well, I think that speakers have in their mind some idea that you want to manage your speech, both at the intersubjective level, but also the metadiscursive one. I just talked about pragmatic markers, but know that we as speakers, we choose between pragmatic markers, but there are also interjections, there are also vocatives. And so in terms of address, in fact, silence also operates at this level, discourse markers as well. And of course, yeah, if you talk about metadiscursive functions, you should take into account the domain of disfluencies more in general, what happens there. So that would be also multidimensional. I'm not able to conceive that either. And of course, if you talk about intersubjective and modal, the whole bunch of stance expressions, they also come into sight. Okay, so I will conclude here. So I just hope to have shown that even though there are already a lot of studies on pragmatic markers, there still is work to be done, more as to articulate the intralinguistic and extralinguistic characteristics. So especially the extralinguistic ones, I think they have to be connected to the regular, more traditional accounts of pragmatic markers, especially as to the indexicality of the forms. And also, well, I would like to check out in the future whether the automatic annotation of intensity and sentiment can, well, still be developed further. So, and then the final idea is that if you then adopt an onomasiological approach, just looking at pragmatic markers and for pragmatic markers is still very limited. It's not how we work as speakers. We choose between other phenomena. So that's always an idea that I take into account. Okay, that was it. So I hope it wasn't too much information, but anyway, thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this presentation. Very interesting presentation. Anyone has questions?
Oh, thank you very much. It was fantastic because, you know, from the morning. So after watching your data and your analysis and your ideas, I just was thinking about, do you have the possibility to look, for example, how the same speaker act with other, for example, you mentioned the hairdresser with the client, but could you see him in another context? I mean, when he's not a hairdresser, when he is the father, when he is the, and do you think that's important and relevant?
I do think it's important to check whether he or she would adapt his language or her language to the discourse setting. We do have a number of speakers in our corpus that are involved in some conversations, but not, well, too many of them. What you can do is then, for instance, but that's a bit different, is that you can follow the speaker throughout a whole conversation, which is also interesting because sometimes speakers adapt their language to the language of the interlocutor. So that would also be alignment and accommodation. So that we could do, but I think it would be really interesting. At some point we tried it. So we also do personality research. So we try to check whether your personality also has an impact on pragmatic markers or vocatives, but apparently personality is not an important factor either. It's mostly about your person, so the individual. So you come with a whole background that, well, of course you are situated in the community, but even then you have your idiosyncratic, specific elements, linguistic elements, also pragmatic markers. But what we didn't do, well, we tried it at some point, so to track a person. So what you can do is that you can program, for instance, a smartphone so that it would at different times during the day start to record. And then afterwards, the person who is being recorded has to indicate, oh, there I was in a meeting with my colleagues, there I was talking to my partner, to my children. At some point, that was an option, but well, we didn't have the time to do that. But it would be very interesting just to check whether the person would change, for instance, his or her language, but as to pragmatic marker, maybe because it's something that automatic, not, but maybe the frequency might change. For instance, for those fillers, maybe if you feel comfortable at home, you will use less fillers. So yeah, so would be interesting. So if you feel like investigating that, let me know.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Fascinating. You mentioned some of the drawbacks of sentiment analysis algorithms.
Yeah.
Have you thought about just using current large language models and see what they output? I mean,
yeah.
The disadvantage, of course, would be that, well, it's a black box. The weights might change tomorrow or next week, and you don't really know how the model gets to its answers.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And in fact, I tried it last week.
Okay.
Well, I was running out of time, but I thought, oh, I can ask ChatGPT. And I just asked ChatGPT, can you do automatic sentiment analysis?
Sure.
And he said, sure, I can. Just give me the files. And that's where I stopped because I was like, no, I don't have time now. But I would like to, yeah, try it out. Well, just ChatGPT, but I guess there are better models still. But well, yeah.
So if you get GPT 4.0 right now, then that is very much the cutting edge.
Yeah.
And
I would do it this summer.
It might not even stop at sentiment analysis. You could try and find it, or try and get it to identify latent factors that you haven't even thought of.
Such as?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. But one factor that I would strongly suspect to be active is priming, just what goes on in the left context of the discourse marker.
Yeah.
Which in itself, of course, isn't a big surprise or, well, very interesting. But if you factor out priming effects, then you get a cleaner image of what the interesting variables are doing, right?
Yeah, it's so complicated because it's such pragmatic markers are so contextualized that, yeah, just looking at functions or whatever, it's never enough. Yeah, but yeah, the model might still be developed further. I think there are so many levels. Yeah. Yeah.
And with regard to the social criteria that you entered in the analysis, there I was thinking, well, all of us, we have a repertoire of things that we can do and we adapt to situations and we want to project different identities. Is there any way of, modeling that level of complexity, or are we,
maybe you would then need indeed data from one person in different situations. Would that help?
You have that, no? You
Yeah, but not systematically.
Okay,
So you would
okay.
really have to, think about, okay, that person, these might be different interesting variations of content, of discourse settings, etc., etc. Because it's not only about different discourse setting, but also about hierarchy, for instance. Is the person to whom you're speaking older or younger? Is it your father or your child? The gender as well. So it's really multifactorial. Yeah, but we did, for the vocative, we did a study with similar variables. And so we did like a decision tree. And what was on top of it was like always the age. So apparently age is like the most determinant variable for you to choose at least some of these items. Yeah, so more than gender and more than social class. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Maybe more one question, short question. I have a question myself. Are you thinking about using this model to study other languages?
Which model then?
I think not a model, your method.
That's a good question. Well, I'm mostly working on Spanish. It could be extended to other languages, but for me, I think it's good to have a model that can be applied to whatever language, meaning that not that the same analysis would apply, but that you can check for the same dimensions. So I think that could work. And especially, for instance, with the automatic sentiment analysis, if you have then, I don't know how ChatGPT acts for Portuguese, but maybe it could also work. And certainly in the future, I guess it will become always more and more powerful. So I think it could work for different models, for different languages. But I think that this at least is quite, well, it's quite general. I think that, but this is really not, how to say, final, but it's just like how I think we should think about it. And
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much again.